Hi, my name is Mr. Cadella, and today I'm going to show you how to blend and shade with colored pencils. We're going to be working on this one-point perspective drawing, but this applies to many different kinds of drawings with colored pencil. The first thing you need to know is that when you're blending and shading with colored pencil, that you want to take your time and think of layers, not trying to do it all in just one step. Now, with this particular project, I'm working on a drawing paper that when I draw over it, you'll see, and I'll move this close to the camera so you can kind of see that, you will see that there are some white specks and grainy parts of the paper there. And a lot of people ask, Mr. Cadella, how do you get your tones and your values so nice and even? And all it is just patience. Notice how I keep kind of going back and over the same spot over and over again. And just taking my time, especially paying very close attention to the edges of things. A lot of people, when they're shading and blending with colored pencils, the edges get a little too fuzzy, and sometimes that's fine, but for this we have this kind of cube type shape here, and we want to keep nice clean edges, crisp edges there. Now the next thing I'm going to talk about is that when you're shading and blending with colored pencils and something that has obviously a light source, you want to identify that light source first. The light is coming from the top on this project. So for this particular project, I'm only going to have one light source. That means the things on the top, like this part here, would be much lighter than things that are underneath, like down inside here. So you have to think about that. That's extremely important. You only have one light source for this particular project. So that means since the light comes down from the top, here, this will be darker over here and possibly darker on this side. This will be lighter over here, and you can see the edge of the candy bar wrapper. It's lighter right here, but darker underneath here. And of course, the most obvious place probably is this C. You see it's lighter on this side and it's darker here. Now, as I'm blending and shading and filling this in, I'm going to talk about the difference between shading and coloring. Coloring is just filling in a space, kind of like what I'm doing right now. Shading means that you have different values that show that there's a light source. So if you look closely right here, I'm starting to darken this area here just a little bit. I want to be very careful in darkening this area. Notice this is a different value. On a 10-point value scale, this would be like, I'd probably say about a 5 value, and this would be maybe a 4 value here. I'm going to actually push this a little darker, so it's probably more like maybe a 6 or 7. Notice the difference in these two values. We call that difference contrast. Okay, as I'm working on this, notice I'm not rushing, I'm not trying to go real fast. Okay, I'm just taking my time, and I'm looking for those little areas that I may need to fill in. This will take time. So I'm going to use just this pink to kind of fill this in, but you notice I've started making this bottom even darker. A lot of people would ask, how did you get that one pink colored pencil to get so dark? Well, it's because I use other colors sometimes and blend it in. I don't use drastically different colors. Sometimes I'll come in, again, paying very close attention to those edges, and I'm going to start layering in some of this darker color. Again, you're not trying to press as hard as you can to begin with. You think of building up layers of colored pencils. I prefer working with a colored pencil that's a little bit on the duller side, so it isn't too super sharp. Those sharp tips tend to break pretty quickly, but sometimes you do have to have a sharp colored pencil to get in those tight spots, maybe like this corner right here. So notice I'm just kind of building up layers, and I can go back and forth between my colored pencils. In fact, a lot of times I do that. I just kind of build up layers, blend them together. I think a colored pencil is more as like sometimes paint that you're kind of mixing. Notice how it's already getting darker. We have a contrast between this value and this value, and that shows us that we have light coming from the top. And you can see it's a little bit darker here. Now I do want to make this part darker on this little green cylinder, so I'm going to go ahead and get a blue colored pencil. I'm going to put just a little bit of blue in here because of course green has blue in it. There we go. Just kind of make it a little darker down here. Since the light's coming from the top, we want to see that shadow. This is very important. You can kind of keep going back over it. The colored pencil doesn't erase very well because it actually has wax in it, but it does erase a little bit. So just take your time and fill in those spots here. The other thing I'm going to talk about is your shadows. Now, this part here is going to cast a shadow right here. So I'm going to make this part a little bit darker. I can have two kinds of shadow. I can press a little bit harder with this. You notice I get my little shadow here. I could even come back with that other colored, blend that in a little bit more. There we go. So it's getting a little darker here. Now I can keep this what I call a hard edge shadow, where the edge of that shadow is pretty crisp and clean and clear. Or you can blur the edge. We call it a soft edge shadow. And there's both kinds, and you can do both on this particular project equally well. I've seen them done both well. Just like that. Now it's kind of blurred out a little bit. And this again will give the effect that there's light coming from the top. Now you can always go back with a little, maybe a lighter color or even white sometimes, and kind of lighten up that top there so it looks like there's light coming from the top as well. Be careful with your lighting directions. I will show you some mistakes now. You see this right here. Let's start with this one here. This is probably one of the most common mistakes I see, is people just kind of, they shade way too light, and it's really scratchy looking, and they just don't really spend a lot of time. In fact, I would call this more just coloring instead of shading. They did attempt to try to make it a little darker in here, but you don't really get the sense of light with this. This requires a lot more time. This is probably done way too quickly. Right here, they're starting to get the idea of lighting. You know, if, for example, the light looks like it's also coming from the top here. But it's obviously way too sloppy. Like, actually all these are pretty sloppy, and they need to take their time and really get in those spots. Okay, this was, again, done way too fast. Now here, this was done just a little bit neater, but notice there's a subtle thing going on. They're actually going two different directions with their colored pencil. You notice when I was working over here, I was kind of going the same direction, up and down right here, to kind of get the same type of direction and that kind of texture on my paper there. Here, they're kind of scribbling in colors and so forth and so on, and it's all one value. There's no contrast. This is the same value as this. In fact, there's a couple different kinds of values in here, so it gets a little mixed up. But over here, you'll see a very definitive edge, a very clear edge, a difference between this value and this value and this value here. And that gives this form very good definition. You can tell what the light is doing to this form. Now, this one's kind of interesting. This person, I will see this every once in a while. They're starting to get the idea they need to take their time and work with light, and they get in their mind, oh yeah, I'm going to use different colors. But they don't really blend them. They use like maybe a purple on this side, a light blue on this side, and a darker blue on this side. The blending that you've seen over here is super important. You have to really, really take your time and just work in layers. This person didn't work in layers. They just kind of plopped on some colors here. So here are some mistakes.